Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Need Some Introduction. I'm Victor, your host, and on this podcast, I try to introduce you, dear listener, to something new or something new to you to discover, to watch on TV, usually TV shows, oftentimes movies, and hopefully provide some insight and context as well. In today's episode, Darren and I will be breaking down the 6th episode of The Day of the Jackal, the recent Peacock assassin/spy thriller. But before then, I will be giving you my review of the new Gladiator sequel, Gladiator 2, already playing around the world and just going into wide release this week in the United States. This is a spoiler-free review, but I will probably, almost certainly, be spoiling aspects of the first Gladiator film. So if you haven't seen that film, I don't know why you would be interested in this review, but definitely check out the original film, which still holds up. And as a matter of fact, I will also be, before all of that, be giving you a rundown of Ridley Scott's very long career. If you've listened to my career retrospectives here on the podcast, I thought that the Tim Burton 20 film cycle was a lot to review and recap. We have nearly 30 films here for Ridley Scott. So many of these I'll be just grouping together, but I do want to speak about at least some of those films, important to discuss as part of his career. And conveniently, I can actually direct you to some of my other retrospective series, for example, the Alien one, which is of course so relevant to Ridley Scott's career. So stay tuned for all of that. Over the weekend, or possibly early in the week, the holiday week, Sohan and I will be discussing a different Peacock series based on a true story, which came back, surprisingly somewhat, for a second series. A popular episode for us here on the podcast when we recapped Season 1, so we will be watching Season 2. Probably not, considering it's an entire binge, probably not going to be in the feed until early next week. Continued coverage of The Day of the Jackal, and next week also the premiere of another spy thriller, The Agency, with Michael Fassbender on Paramount Plus and Showtime. And in anticipation of Severance, which was a huge hit for us here on the podcast, by the way. Many of you started listening to us during that stretch of coverage. And now we're talking almost 3 years ago, everybody. It's pretty crazy. I myself need a refresher on Severance, so I will be rewatching it and republishing those original conversations. So expect to see all those episodes dropping in the next month and a half or so, all leading up to the Severance premiere. And of course, we have some very big films being released, both giant blockbusters like Gladiator, like Wicked, like the Moana sequel, as well as all of the anticipated Oscar competitors, which of course will be coming out in the next month to a month and a half, and expect to see reviews of all of those here in the feed as well. You can follow me on Letterboxd. The link is in the show notes. I'll also include Darren's Letterboxd profile link there as well, because I review older films, review genre films, review films that are sometimes not as mainstream, that don't make it here onto the podcast. So do follow me there if you'd like to see my list of noteworthy films of 2024, for example, which of course is a constantly updating list based on the films I'm watching. And I'll definitely be referencing those reviews and that building list when I get to the end of the year, where we'll have a end of year recap with all of my co-hosts, and maybe some of you out there would like to participate. Send me emails with TV shows, movies, and any general shout outs that you'd like to include in a year-end episode. I could read your emails on the air, or even better, record an audio memo on your smartphone and attach it to an email, needssomeintroduction@gmail.com. And that episode should come out right after the first of the year. Okay, let's start the review of Gladiator 2 by traveling back to the mid-70s. Ridley Scott had made quite a few TV movies, very well respected, also had done a lot of advertisements, and was really known as a really impressive visual stylist. And of course, to this day, he has a very signature style. You oftentimes know you are seeing a Ridley Scott film or one of his imitators. And then in 1977, he directed a film called The Duelists, starring Keith Carradine and Harvey Keitel as two Frenchmen. Despite the strange casting here, this is actually a beautiful looking film. As a film, it pales in comparison to something that came out almost exactly the same period of time, Barry Lyndon from Stanley Kubrick. But it's definitely interesting to watch it, especially if you want to see it as a bookend to Napoleon, in all the wrong ways, I would say. This is all practically shot. It is the creation of a particular visual language that you'll see throughout his films, whereas Napoleon is all special effects. Even the sets feel artificial, probably CGI augmented. This is the Napoleon movie, I mean. And it is very interesting to see this very authentic looking but low scale film set during this French Revolution period of time, and to counterpoint it to the immense bloat of the Napoleon film from last year. So as a bookend to a career, and Ridley's now 86 years old and still active, by the way. He is still planning more films. He may even do another Gladiator sequel, depending on the success of this one. And he'll probably have another one in between there. He has constantly worked. He would churn out a film maybe every 2 years on average, and now maybe every year. So he has an enormous body of work, but maybe diminishing returns. We'll get to the review of Gladiator 2 in just a moment. Way more important than The Duelist, which was a mild success financially. I think it played the Cannes Film Festival, got almost unanimously solid reviews. 2 years after that, he made the film Alien. And of course, we already covered the Alien franchise here in the feed. Check out the episode where I reviewed Alien Romulus, a very popular episode, by the way, on the feed here. And you can hear a little bit more about him at that period of time. And another counterpoint to the way he shoots now, there's something cold but thrilling in the way that film is made with this floating camera, which he operated himself most of the time. Before there was even steady camera, he was operating his own camera, following the actors through these labyrinth of the spaceship. And once again, you think about, in contrast to some of his later films, his most recent ones, I'll get to it later on, he'll have 10 cameras running at once. He shoots very, very quickly. He lights everything for once. This is good for the actors who get to play out long scenes, and then he has many shot selections. But there's an impersonality, I think, personally, to his most recent films that feels so utterly different than these early films. And that was a massive financial success and gave him a blank check for most of his career. And he needed it because he missed the mark so many times financially, starting with his very next film. In 1982, Blade Runner. Now, this is an incredibly important film. It popularized the whole genre of tech noir. We would not have a Matrix without Blade Runner, for example. And you think about how popular anime has become. So many anime films are directly referencing the world building within Blade Runner itself. And Christopher Nolan, I don't know if this is still the case, but for years, every time he started a project, he'd have the entire production team and cast sit down and watch Blade Runner. And he would use that as a template to say, this is the level of craftsmanship and this is the level of performance and dedication we need across the board. So it's the performances, it's the visual decisions, it's the set design. He wanted everything to be at the highest level. And when he wanted to prime the pump on his productions, he would show everybody Blade Runner. I don't know if that's still the case, but until very recently, that was the case. So once again, a massive influence on Christopher Nolan, who of course is maybe one of our most important filmmakers working today. So just in that one way, this huge legacy. Now, at the time when Blade Runner came out, I was very young, but I did eventually catch up with it. It's one of those things that was just on television all the time, on VHS. And I watched Alien, and I watched Blade Runner specifically, more so Blade Runner, over and over again, as I was just beginning to be a cinephile. But I never took Ridley Scott seriously as a filmmaker, despite how much I absolutely adored the Blade Runner film. Even the original version, by the way, because we didn't have all those alternate versions, which only improved on that original version of the film. Another thing that basically becomes a theme, not only culturally when you have all these director's cuts, but also Scott's films themselves improved by longer versions. But the reason I never really put him on the pantheon, as I was just starting, as a teenager getting really into film, this is probably mid to late 80s, there were my guys. There was Coppola. There was Scorsese. Of course, Scorsese. Kubrick. There was Kubrick. There was Lynch. I was a huge David Lynch fan. Probably my gateway for film appreciation in the first place. And then, of course, there was the film. There was Blade Runner. And there was Alien. The films. Both from Ridley Scott. And yet, he didn't make the Mount Rushmore. Because even at the time, even when I was younger, I felt like he was a stylist and not an author of the films, as good as those films were. Part of the reason I had that opinion was because of the volume of films that he put out and how often he missed, aside from those two utter classics. And of course, The Duelist, also a solid film. But he also became a truly iconic advertisement director. He did the Chanel No. 5 ads. If you haven't seen them, they're very moody, very beautiful, incredible aesthetics. And most importantly, in 1984, he made the Apple ad, the Mac launch, 1984. If you've never seen this, you should definitely watch it. It's on YouTube. And it basically, in that one advertisement, has set in everyone's mind what the novel 1984 is. When you read that, you automatically see his visuals. And maybe it was the fact that, think about this, it's 83, it's 84. This is literally the launch of MTV, 1983, and then its explosion across the media in 1984. All the all the videos had this aesthetic, the same aesthetic as Ridley Scott. And of course, Tony Scott, his brother, was about to start making movies himself, but also they had a production house together. They did a lot of advertisements. They did a lot of music videos. So the MTV aesthetic, in a way, cheapened what he offered. But it's not just that. My criticism of Scott is that when the material and his style and his obsessions mesh together, he makes a great film. But he will apply those same aesthetics no matter what the material is. And that doesn't always work with the material. And to that point, he followed up Blade Runner with a beautiful looking film, Legend, which if you haven't seen it, you should definitely check this out. Tim Curry plays this demonic character, incredible prosthetics. Tom Cruise, yeah, that's right, Tom Cruise at the baby stages of his fame. At the time, I remember thinking like Cruise was not cut out for that role. For some reason now, it works for me much better. But some of the aesthetics, this glittery look, the prog rock soundtrack doesn't really work for me at all. And there's nothing worse, by the way. There are unicorns in this fantasy world. The unicorns running in slow motion through the forest with their actual horns wobbling back and forth. You can't have that. I mean, unicorn horns can't be floppy. I'm sorry. So some of it looks cheap and cheesy, but some of the aesthetics, are iconic. They have influenced all these fantasy films to come. So just as some kind of curio, it's interesting. But it speaks to the fact that the material doesn't work. This is terrible. But a supercut of this movie on YouTube, which there are, works great because some of the visuals are so iconic. They have basically permeated all of fantasy filmmaking from that day forward. And this was a huge flop. And by the way, Blade Runner, eventually a very profitable film. It was like the Fight Club of its time, where a huge flop when it came out and then, of course, becomes incredibly important to film history. He makes a pretty nondescript Someone to Watch Over Me, a modern film noir. Pretty boring, I have to tell you. And then he used that as a launch pad for another noir, much bigger budget, Black Rain, starring Michael Douglas, which was kind of a flop in the U.S. Douglas was at the peak of his fame here, so the film kind of flopped in the U.S., but was a huge hit overseas because he was an international superstar at this point. That was a win in his win column. And then he followed that up with Thelma and Louise. So this is the next important film in his career. This feminist parable about these two women on the lam and how all of culture is against them in a way, and how becoming outlaws and basically throwing out all expectations of gender norms and expectations of that even they personally had is liberating in its way. So in a way, we've seen so many outlaw films where that's exactly the case, right? You basically choose to not live in society anymore, and it's liberating, but then society won't accept that. Solid film. The performances are terrific from the two lead ladies. It's been rediscovered recently. It's over 30 years old at this point. But most of the reason this works is because of the script. Because here's where I'm going to criticize Scott, and I will say this is still his fallow period. For me, his fallow period goes all the way up until Gladiator. And the reason is that Thelma and Louise has a visual style. That same sun-blasted, smoke-filled interiors with the light streaming through slatted windows and giant mechanical fans ominously in the background, which works great for the mechanical world of Blade Runner. But what does it add thematically to this story of these women on the lam? And not only that, the stylistics don't evolve over the course of the film. Like you could imagine it becoming more barren and more isolated, or opposite, maybe becoming more ethereal as the women become more liberated. It is the same palette from beginning to end. So there's no choice being made other than him smearing on his usual style. Now, this sounds very negative. I actually like many of his films, but I just feel like in this particular case, the stylistics do not match. It just does not match what the material needs. But the film works, like I said, because of the script, because of the performances, because some of the action sequences are well staged. And all of a sudden, he was back in the cultural conversation. But almost immediately, he ran into some trouble again with a string of unsuccessful films. Just 1 year later, he made the massive budget Conquest of Paradise, the Gerard Depardieu Christopher Columbus movie, which came out in one of these circumstances where you have two similar films, two Christopher Columbus films in the same year. Of course, the 500th anniversary of 1492. And this film was a flop. It did decently overseas, but once again, huge budget. This is going to be a repeating pattern here, although it doesn't look great. He follows that up with a pretty good movie called White Squall. It's kind of Dead Poets Society meets Lord of the Flies, based on a true story, starring Jeff Bridges, doing a really good job here with these boys on this yacht, and they learn some life lessons, but something tragic happens. They hit a white squall, and then Jeff Bridges' culpability in it. This one works pretty well, actually, and was a huge flop. Not massively budgeted, but didn't make any money at all. And it's actually kind of forgotten. I think they definitely wanted it to be another Dead Poets Society just some 8 years after that film. And it didn't work popularly, although I think it's a pretty good film. And I think the visuals being on the water, he uses the vistas well. And then just 1 year after that, he makes G.I. Jane, of course, now popularly in the culture again after the slap, the Will Smith, Chris Rock slap, and the joke about G.I. Jane. Demi Moore actually gives a pretty good performance here. And the action, for the most part, pretty generic, but well done. And this is, again, another pattern here. This was a relatively expensive film, very high profile because of Demi Moore at the time shaving her hair and baring her body. She got paid a lot of money for this. And the film did okay. I mean, it didn't lose money. It didn't really make much money either. Audiences didn't really love it. So he was having a rough stretch again, had not been able to capitalize on the Thelma and Louise hit, and really hadn't made that kind of film again that was in awards contention. And to me, he's just the Hollywood stylist. And that was basically my opinion of him. And a couple other really important points here is that his brother, Tony Scott, had huge success with Top Gun and Beverly Hills Cop 2. And I like some Tony Scott films. We'll get to some later. But in general, he was even more so just a stylist. And honestly, it felt a lot like Ridley's style. The editing was much more fast-paced, much more MTV. But I think there were so many copycats at this point of Ridley Scott's style, including his brother. And of course, we're talking 97 now when this film comes out, G.I. Jane. We're already past Michael Bay putting out his first film. And then, of course, Michael Bay is going to become a huge action director in the next 10, 15 years beyond this point. So all of this felt like a redundancy. Ridley Scott had lost whatever mojo he had early in his career and was repeating himself visually. And honestly, I didn't feel like he was really connecting with the material. And just when he seemed like he was over the hill, he had a huge hot streak. And it begins in 2000, 24 years ago, with Gladiator. This film came out and, of course, featured Russell Crowe, just about to explode as a megastar, and Joaquin Phoenix, of course, about to have a multi-decade career as one of the most well-respected actors of his generation. And this film was a true phenomenon. It opened really well, played well around the world, stayed in theaters throughout the summer, ended up winning Best Picture almost a year later by the time the awards rolled around, became a massive success on DVD. It was one of those films everybody had to show off their new television, for example, or their new sound system, probably even more so. And all of a sudden, everybody was very interested in Ridley Scott. He followed that up just 1 year later with the massively successful, but probably partially disastrous, I think, Hannibal, the sequel to Silence of the Lambs. This film really, audiences did not like this. They didn't really like the book either. I think there's a lot of really interesting things about this adaptation, but this film overall doesn't really work for me, but it was a huge financial success all over the world. The Lecter character, of course, incredibly famous at this point. But from the point of view of Ridley's career, I thought this was pretty weak. In my mind, I remember these scenes where you have FBI agents bouncing off the hood of cars, dodging cars that are breaking police barricades, while people bounce off the hoods in slow motion. And at this point, between like CSI and so many of these other police procedurals, it really felt like he was copying a copy. Well, it's pretty dispassionate, although the weirdest parts about this work pretty well. Like when the dinner scenes, the grotesque dinner scene towards the end, actually is pretty interestingly assembled. But honestly, it's strange that he even did this. Maybe he just wanted to keep that hot streak going. He likes to work very quickly. And speaking of that, not only did Hannibal come out in 2001, he also made Black Hawk Down, which logistically is such a huge production, just from the point of view of the number of action setups we're talking about here, and the special effects when the CGI is not fully there yet. There's a lot of practical effects for the chopper going down, for example. So the idea that he made Gladiator and Hannibal and Black Hawk Down, and they all were released within a little bit over a year and a half, is astonishing. These are not small productions. So he can produce very quickly. We'll get around to it, but Gladiator 2 took 51 days to shoot. It's an incredibly quick turnaround. Most large films like that take 100 days, and then they have reshoots. So literally half as long. And this was another hit. This got Academy Award nominations. It looks great. I think the action is very immediate, very powerful. There was a lot of these anti-war but embedded type films in this period of time. This is one of the best of them. If I'll be critical of this at all, he very intentionally is making the people in the streets that are attacking the Black Hawk chopper soldiers basically into analogs for zombies out of a zombie movie, which isn't a great look considering what the themes of the film are supposed to be. But from the immediacy of being in battle, it's one of the absolute best versions of this. And again, so many of these shots of the camera mounted on top of the vehicles have been ripped off many times by Michael Bay and many other filmmakers as well. So again, he makes a template for a certain type of film. And so this is a very important film for this genre of filmmaking and video games, by the way, which copy a lot of these shots as well. And then a film I don't really like that much, which was kind of a flop, by the way. Definitely a flop, I should say. Totally underperformed at the box office. This was Nicolas Cage coming towards a downturn in his mega stardom. The film is Matchstick Men. It has a twist, which I think is not very good, but this is one of those films that people say, oh, you got to watch it for the twist. This film, basically in general, doesn't work for me, but it definitely has its supporters. So this is probably considered a win for him overall, but it loses money. And then he makes the massively budgeted Kingdom of Heaven, which I did not watch. This is, again, where I was kind of being very selective about what I would and would not see. The length of the film really turned me off. And this one, if you're going to watch this, I have not seen either version of this, by the way. But I know from basically everybody who's seen it, you do not want to see the original version. You want to see the director's cut, which is much longer. But everyone says the director's cut is a masterpiece. And everybody thinks that the theatrical version is mediocre at best. So definitely go with the longer version. I have not watched it. Maybe over the holidays, I'll catch up on it and put my opinions of it here in the feed. But from his career standpoint, a box office flop. And then he reunited yet again with Russell Crowe to make A Good Year, which I think was a good idea for Crowe to scale down and make basically a romantic film. When this film came out, it was trashed by critics. Audiences completely rejected it. It wasn't that expensive, but made no money at all. And it was one of the signposts that Crowe's stardom was fading. But most people who watch it now enjoy it. Once again, did not see it, so I can't really judge that one. I did see the next one, though, Russell Crowe again, and very importantly, Denzel Washington. Denzel Washington, by the way, had been making multiple films with Tony Scott. The excellent Crimson Tide, and later Man on Fire, Deja Vu, all entertaining films, all the way up until 2010, including The Taking of Pelham 123 and Unstoppable. So one of, if not the director that Denzel Washington has worked with the most. And here he is in American Gangster, working with Ridley Scott for the first time. And that movie is, yet again, every time he has these big misses, loses a lot of money, he'll have another hit to save his bacon. And American Gangster was a big hit, made a lot of money, got Academy Award nominations. Terrific supporting performance by Crowe as well. Both of these actors with a lot of charisma, but different types of charisma, works really well in that film. Not everything works perfectly in that film, but definitely the charisma of the two actors. They really ideally would have had more scenes together, which they have relatively few scenes together. And then another dud, despite having Russell Crowe, despite having Leonardo DiCaprio in Body of Lies, an expensive film that didn't really make any money. And then, of course, worst of all, this is really something that hurt Crowe's career significantly more than Ridley Scott's. Robin Hood. The Robin Hood film lost a huge amount of money. This may be his biggest financial flop. Everybody thought it was going to be another Gladiator. Russell Crowe really needed a big hit. And the failure of this film, which was supposed to turn into a series, was maybe the last time, I believe, that Crowe was ever given a budget of this size. Ridley recovered just 2 years later by making the massively expensive Prometheus, a film I don't really like. If you want to hear my full review of that, check out that Alien episode like I mentioned before. But it looks incredible. And for me, it's maybe the best version, and maybe because it's science fiction, of this blend of a lot of CGI, but stunt work that feels immediate and tactile and believable, even though it's these two very different styles of things. His CGI work, compared to many other filmmakers, is actually pretty strong, but is still recognizable, especially when he uses it as much as he does here. But once again, you can get away with it with a sci-fi film, I think. And then a really fascinating film, definitely his most despised film from audiences, and that's saying a lot. He has quite a few films that audiences have rejected, but The Counselor, which is an absolutely fascinating film. If you're not squeamish about violence and some sexual content, you should check this out. This is a really strange film. Michael Fassbender, Penelope Cruz, Brad Pitt, an incredible cast. But this film actually was just lambasted by critics. And during the production of this film, by the way, something extremely tragic happens, which is that Tony Scott committed suicide, his brother, the famous director. And oftentimes people think that The Counselor was like a reaction to this, but he was actually finishing production on that film at the time when he heard the news about his brother. He actually had to shut down production towards the end of that film's production schedule for that very reason. And it is a nihilistic and pessimistic view of humanity, which you could imagine would be perhaps his mood at the time of his brother's suicide. But I think it's too facile to make that connection, considering he had greenlit this project almost a year before the events. Nonetheless, it is a almost complete failure with fascinating parts about it. And I kind of love films that try to be different and don't fully succeed, but at least try for something. And I know that now this film has, little by little, been building up a reputation. I disagree that it's good, but it is interesting. And I believe one of the very few Cormac McCarthy screenplays that have ever been produced. By the way, if you've ever read No Country for Old Men and you like that very sparse writing in that was originally written as a screenplay. And then when he couldn't get it made into a movie, he turned it into prose, but kept it very sparse, as he writes anyway, but even more so in that novel. So if you ever wonder why there's so much dialogue and these like very curt descriptions in between, it really was intended as a screenplay. He then made a movie about Moses, Exodus, Gods and Kings, another massively expensive financial disaster. And every time you think, wow, this guy's got like 2 or 3 huge flops in a row, his career's got to be waning again, right? He's going to be struggling to get a green light. But you know what he would do? He works so fast that he's already 2 movies beyond it. So if the movie flops, he's got 1 movie in the can. It's about to come out within 6 or 7 months. And he's starting production on the next film. So it's almost like they can't shut him down because one's already finished. So that one's going to come out no matter what. And then the next one, pulling the plug on that one at this point would be too late. So it might potentially impact 3 or 4 films down the line. But it never happens because guess what? After having this string of failures, he then makes The Martian, which is one of his absolute best films. Perfectly weaponizes Damon's charisma. It once again uses his cold, aesthetic, mechanical almost style with flourishes of these beautiful vistas and really well choreographed action sequences. All of this works perfectly. Once again, shot very quickly, and then a lot of time spent on getting the visuals absolutely perfect in post-production. It's something you can do when you have a lot of the film is just Matt Damon talking into the camera. But of course, that's not all of it. The visuals are actually really impressive here. This is a really fun movie. If you've never seen it, you absolutely should watch it. It's of his most recent films, his best, just a total blast. And it goes on the Mount Rushmore of his films for sure. For me, I'll just call it now because I don't think it gets better from here. You obviously have Alien. You obviously have Blade Runner, Gladiator, and then The Martian. And then right after The Martian, Prometheus had been so expensive that even though it was a big success, audiences didn't really love it that much. It didn't have a long tail. But because of the success of The Martian, he was able to get Alien Covenant made. And he really wanted to make this trilogy mostly about the Michael Fassbender character, who's terrific. I do not like these films, by the way, but I do like the Michael Fassbender character. And he, of course, is the star of the show in this Alien Covenant film. And it's another big flop. But at this point, he was an industry unto himself. He had actually been, him and Tony Scott together, through their Scott-free production, had produced many other TV series, movies, the most successful of which probably was The Good Wife and then The Good Fight. Excellent shows, by the way. So in a way, part of the reason he could fail as a director, as long as the films didn't lose too much money, is that he was his own producer, so he managed his own financing. And overall, as I mentioned, he would miss twice, then he'd have a hit, and that would subsidize the rest of his career. And since then, since Alien Covenant, he has become a very proficient director. He knocks out a film, almost one a year. He is now 86 years old, so probably right around the time he turned 80. He changed the way he produced things. He has a technique where he will have one setup with 10 or 11 cameras going at the same time. The cameras, of course, it has to be very well placed, so the cameras aren't into each other's eye lines. He's shooting some actors in extreme close-up. He's getting master shots. He's got cameras moving to capture the action in the room. And then he shoots very, very quickly. He shoots very long takes on these very well-covered sets, camera coverage, I mean. And then he has a lot of options when he's assembling after the fact. I personally think it makes his filmmaking extremely impersonal. It may be very efficient. It may be cost-effective. It allows him to do a lot of post-production, which, by the way, his over-reliance on CGI is a ding for me in general with his late career films. That includes Gladiator 2. Teaser for my review forthcoming. The same year he made Alien Covenant, he followed that up with All the Money in the World. This was a very troubled production, modestly successful. Just the fact it came out was considered a success. And just to speak to how quickly he works, this is the year Kevin Spacey was canceled, and then all his scenes were reshot with Christopher Plummer playing J. Paul Getty, and he ended up getting an Academy Award nomination for his performance for footage that was all reshot. So the film met its Christmas release date, even though a big chunk of the film needed to be reshot. And this honestly speaks well to the assembly line production process that he has, where the actors' shots are all compartmentalized to a large extent to prevent any kind of production delays. But this, I think, is part of that impersonal filmmaking that he has, that you could really just pop out, like you're doing software or something, just pop out a whole person and pop in another person, and it doesn't impact any other shots. It's too good to be true. And I mean, the work, I think, shows that somehow. But impressive. He made the film on time, and this actor got an Academy Award nomination. It's a good performance, by the way, although the film, not so great. And he continued to be following up on Prometheus and following up on Alien Covenant. He was really fixated on this idea of the origin of life and the meaning of life. If we are accidental creations, this has become something that really fixates him, I think, later in his career, and maybe as he faces his own mortality. And this, of course, led to a very bloated, I think visually this series doesn't really work for me. It has some interesting ideas in it. Raised by Wolves only lasted 2 seasons, available on Max still. It might be available on Netflix as well, so check it out there if you are curious to see it. If you like this kind of very dense sci-fi, this doesn't really work for me as a show. I couldn't stick with it, but I know people are big proponents of it, so check it out. He has directed some of those episodes as well, really part of his filmography for sure. And then a film I never saw that got caught up in the delays of the pandemic. This one I should check out. I've heard good things about it. The Last Duel, with Ben Affleck and Matt Damon and Adam Driver, all actors I appreciate, along with Jodie Comer. And I like this concept that you're telling the same history from multiple perspectives. You even have multiple screenwriters. You have Nicole Holofcener, who I'm a big fan of hers, by the way, writing the Jodie Comer's POV scenes. All of this is very intriguing, and yet I've never seen it. So that one's definitely, maybe, once again, something for me to catch up on during the holidays. And while that film flopped terribly, of course, came out during the pandemic and really didn't reclaim itself, although it has built a reputation as a good film, never really made itself financially successful given its pretty large budget. He did follow that up with House of Gucci, another film I have not seen, but that one came out at the tail end of the pandemic and was a pretty solid hit. Came out at Thanksgiving in 2021. It wasn't like a comic book movie. It was the first adult targeted film that came out in that period of time and was considered a pretty solid success. Okay, and finally, this is an incredibly long career, but finally we get to his most recent films. First of all, Napoleon, a complete bloated mess as far as I'm concerned. I'm not going to break it all down. If you have Apple TV, of course, anybody listening to this, you have Apple TV. If you've been listening to any of our coverage of those series that we've been covering recently with Joaquin Phoenix playing Napoleon, this film doesn't work for me at all, despite some pretty well designed, and I mean that, designed action sequences, which are almost all computer generated. In the same way that I don't like CGI in horror films, I also don't like a huge reliance on CGI in a historical context, because these are real places, these are real people, historical figures. The idea that it feels like a science fiction movie immediately takes me out of it. There is a director's cut of this, which supposedly improves on the theatrical cut, and I believe that's also available on Apple TV, so check those out if you're curious. All right, and finally we arrive at Gladiator 2. Okay, I'm not going to spoil Gladiator 2, but I didn't really enjoy this film. Long story short, after all this preamble, this is what we get to. For many of the reasons I outlined in the career retrospective, maybe in the same way that I feel that he missed what was so powerful in the original Alien film with those Alien prequels, I again feel like this is, and I've said this so many times, this is a script problem, but the director, even if you don't write the script, is responsible for approving the script, because that's what he's going to shoot for the screen. And of course, the director in film in general is the arbiter of what the final version of the script will be. And in my Letterboxd review, I said, am I not entertained? No, I'm not entertained, basically. But I gave it 2.5 stars because I was impressed with some parts of it. But in preparing for this review, I don't even know I would give it 2.5 stars. Once again, I will not spoil things, but we have Paul Mescal is our star this time. And the film is wrong-footed for me almost from the very start. We start with a large action sequence, this battle, which Mescal's forces lose, and he ends up imprisoned. And of course, that's what leads to him becoming a gladiator in the arena. And this film is so wrong-footed. As I mentioned before, I like to have the CGI sparingly used, if possible, and to be as practical as possible, especially when you have these historical epics. And we begin with these giant action sequence in a city we know nothing about, where Paul Mescal's character, Lucius, is defending. We meet his wife, who's also a warrior. And once again, I am going to spoil Gladiator 1, by the way. But in the original Gladiator movie, there is this deep loss and so much time spent the first third of that film, which is longer than this one, by the way, but this one feels longer than that one because it's so episodic. We have time spent with Russell Crowe so we understand why he's on this vengeance mission. We feel his loss, this tragic loss he's had. And then we see him become this single-minded killing machine. All of that gets yada-yada'd in the beginning of Gladiator 2. The action sequences aren't earthy and grounded, and we sense the stakes. They're impersonal and gigantic. We have no idea who these people who are fighting. We've known them for 2 seconds. The tragedy that we're supposed to feel for Lucius is weightless because we have no relationship to him. We have no relationship to the characters that perish in this battle sequence. And then just a few minutes into the film, he's enslaved and being prepared for his first gladiatorial fight. This, of course, is when he meets Macrinus, a former slave, played by Denzel Washington. The one thing that absolutely works in this film. The film that Denzel Washington is in is fun and interesting, and it's a soap opera. It's campy sometimes, but it is a completely different film than the shoehorned in elements from Gladiator. And it really feels like that. It feels like they wanted to do the Denzel Washington master manipulator storyline, but they had to make it into a Gladiator film. So let's just take some of the elements of Gladiator and just really episodically drop them into this film. It just feels like we are going from one movie to another. It does start to coalesce at the end, but it doesn't work. It really misses the mark in so many ways. When you finally get inside the ring, the first battle sequence is all these men fighting against rabid monkeys or baboons. Not baboons, I guess they're monkeys. And we have not one emperor, but we have two. Joseph Quinn playing Emperor Gaeta, and Fred Heckinger, who I've liked when I've seen him in White Lotus. I liked him. I liked him in Thelma this year, playing Emperor Caracalla. These are both based on a hyperbolized version of two actual brothers who were emperor at the same time. And these two characters, especially Heckinger's character, is such a hilariously ridiculous character. And I don't mean it as it's supposed to be intentionally hilarious. I mean, it feels like someone doing a school play accidentally in a big budget movie. And I say this, by the way, as someone who's enjoyed Heckinger's performances in the past. But even this is so wrong-footed. Again, missing what is interesting about the first Gladiator film. Joaquin Phoenix is a truly great villain in the first Gladiator film. He's sympathetic, even though he's absolutely monstrous and despicable in every possible way. You feel bad for him. He has this deep emotional wound which drives all of his toxic behavior. And it's relatable. We know people, of course, they're not emperors who have this uncontrolled power, but we know people who are like this, that their self-focused desperation, these horrible decisions that are being made, are all grounded in this grievance that they cannot let go of. They're their own worst enemies and dangerous, more dangerous because of it. He's a great villain. These characters have no weight at all. You have split that craziness among two characters, but given them no other qualities other than, look at this crazy guys. Look, one of the council members a monkey, get it? I mean, it's just that level of thought. And then since I am not spoiling Gladiator 2, they try to tie in the events of this film directly to Gladiator. Every time they make these direct callbacks to the first Gladiator movie, it is like embarrassingly painful. Like really it is, for me anyway. Your mileage may vary, of course. And then we even split the heroic storyline between Lucius, the Paul Mescal character, and Pedro Pascal, who of course is in charge of the defeat of the city. So these two characters are on a collision course for this vengeance plot. But it turns out Pedro Pascal is actually trying to save the kingdom himself and has his own political strategy going on. So they should be working together, but Lucius does not see him for what he really is, given his experiences with him, obviously. And this could be interesting as well, but then is kind of dismissed halfway through the film. Connie Nielsen is back to tie it into the original film as well. She has an even bigger part here. I won't go into it once again. Don't want to spoil things for those of you who haven't seen the film. And at this point, you might be thinking, but Victor, you've barely talked about Paul Mescal. And I have to say, I had not seen anything that Paul Mescal had done, even though he had done some pretty well-regarded work. And when I heard he had been cast in Gladiator 2, I did some homework. So the first thing I'd seen of his, he plays a secondary role in All of Us Strangers from last year, a film that didn't really work for me, but I liked his performance. There's a certain kindness and a woundedness, but then a coldness that can come over him as well that I thought worked well there. And then after that, I had seen his breakout role in Normal People, and I thought he was excellent in that. Of course, very early in his career, he was very young at the time. And again, he had this interesting charisma where he was attractive. He played the romantic lead, but he was awkward. He has this insecurity, but he's physically imposing. And he seems to be channeling something real within himself. So I really like that. And of course, just last week, for the first time, I finally saw After Sun. Again, performing a certain persona while being wounded, depressed, confused. I think he works really well in all those films. But in Gladiator 2, he brings some of that same energy. And I will say that maybe this is all intentional because he does rise to the challenge. It's almost like you see him transform over the course of the film, slowly becoming this leader of men type character. But for such a long period of time, the vast majority of the film, he does not emerge as that character. We see him as he's physically imposing. He sells the action sequences. But in all of these interpersonal interactions throughout the film, he's so interior, which is not what the role needs, I think. And of course, it makes me think about the first Gladiator film. Only on revisiting this, there's a episode of the podcast I've never published where I ran down the Beverly Hills Cop movies and Eddie Murphy's career in general. And in watching that first film, so much of the power of that film, and also the first Ghostbusters film as well, is seeing somebody become a superstar in front of your eyes. Just the charisma that exudes from Eddie Murphy or from Bill Murray in the Ghostbusters films, or when you see Jennifer Lawrence in the Hunger Games films, someone just going supernova with their charisma. And of course, it's the same thing with Gladiator. Russell Crowe is such a charisma machine in that film that even when he's doing very little, he sells everything in there. And Mescal's much more subtle and interior technique works great for After Sun. I thought it was very effective. I don't know if it works in this type of film, especially when you have a film that is in every way less successful than that first Gladiator film. It's so messy. You are away from him for long periods of time. We have spent just a few minutes with him, and then we are with the Denzel Washington character doing all his political maneuvering, and then we're with the Connie Nielsen character and Pedro Pascal's character while they're doing their particular machinations. Then we have the crazy emperors and their shenanigans, and then we just hop around. And just given how campy, for example, some of these aspects are, the fact that Denzel Washington is a charisma monster in his sequences, and we really want to see, well, what's he up to right now? All of that makes the scenes we spend with this very earnest and likable character, but in some ways, some of the dullest moments earlier in the film. It's such a weird imbalance to what the film is trying to do. You could have this trajectory of his character, which is within this film, but that could be its own storyline, but then constantly shifting gears and leaving him for minutes at a time, that doesn't work. It just doesn't work. And not only does all of that not work, another thing that's really thrilling in watching the Gladiator film again, the original, is that so much of it is practical. So much of these battle sequences, there is actually a giant person trying to slash at our hero. Seeing a bunch of CGI monkeys, or seeing a giant rhino, or seeing something, by the way, from the absolutely crazy Nick Cave, the musician, wrote a screenplay for Russell Crowe as a sequel to the original Gladiator, which starts in the afterworld and then comes back to the regular world, and then it time travels all the way up to modern times. It's absolutely batshit. But it featured one thing that we see in this very film, which was the Colosseum flooded and full of alligators, or maybe crocodiles would be more appropriate. We see that in this film. But even that is so impersonal. It's almost like an Easter egg for, hey, remember that crazy thing in that other script that never got produced? We got it here. Look, but they flooded the Colosseum. How did they flood the Colosseum? How does the water not just get like sucked into the sand? It's a huge spectacle. But once again, like so many of the battle sequences here, completely impersonal. It's just like, and now this thing happens. And now back to Lucius in his prison cell talking to Denzel Washington or talking to Connie Nielsen. It's as if all these scenes were shot in a 1 or 2 week period with different characters showing up to the same sets and then assembled after the fact. And then the action sequences were all like a Marvel movie. The action sequences were all being developed in parallel and then just dropped into the film. And of course, the only thing that does work is the Denzel Washington character and his trajectory. Okay, and then the last thing I'll say, which seems so obvious, I don't even understand why this film exists to an extent, other than to make money, of course, is that you are negating the original Gladiator film. Once again, I will not spoil Gladiator 2. I am not spoiling anything in Gladiator 2, but I will spoil Gladiator 1. At the end of that film, Crowe's character is more than happy to die because he's like, I have defeated the person who took away everybody I loved. I will reunite with them in Elysium. And there's like this voiceover that says, now Rome will be free. You've done it. Look what you've done. You freed Rome. And if you believe that, after seeing the first film, well, here's Rome X number of years later. It's terrible. They're oppressing everybody. They're still enslaved people. They're still gladiators in the ring. All the things that supposedly were going to end at the end. So Russell Crowe's sacrifice was worth nothing? Well, he's not worth nothing because of something that happens in this film, which I can't tell you, but it's not enough. You've negated the first film for very, very little upside here, I would say. But if you see this, do appreciate Denzel Washington, who's doing something different here. First of all, that charisma's on display as usual, doing a very different type of his charisma here, and just making some great choices. There's a scene where things don't go his way, I'll just say, at one point in the film. And his facial reaction, like his reaction to this is, in the moment, it seems to be like spontaneous reaction he has, this bafflement, this shock that things didn't go the way he expected. It's such a interesting choices he's making in this film. And he will probably, even if the film will probably make money, it has enough spectacle to, I think, interest a popular audience. But yeah, didn't work for me. I gave it 2.5 stars. I mean, I guess I'll keep it there because of Denzel's performance, but that's about it, man. Like, this is rough stuff for me and disappointing. This shouldn't have been so hard, to be honest, to make a successful follow-up film, I have to say, but that's where we're at. And if this makes enough money, they actually are prepared to make yet another one. Scott, as I mentioned before, is now 86 years old. So will he be the one to direct it? Possibly. And in a lot of ways, given especially Mescal's performance, that trajectory of his charisma emerging towards the end of the film, it feels in many ways like maybe this is all set up for that next film. So maybe that one will have the payoff that this one does not. That all remains to be seen. Okay, you made it this far. This is very long, much longer than I expected. But if you are looking for the conversation about this most recent episode of The Day of the Jackal, well, it starts right here. So I've been fast forwarding through this commentary. This is where you stop fast forwarding. I have a couple of questions for you. My wife, at this very moment, is watching Say Nothing. Have you heard of this series?
Say Nothing. Remind me.
It's about the Troubles in Ireland. It's based on the best-selling nonfiction novel from a couple of years ago. I think it won a number of awards, actually. And Hulu did a 9-part series based on it, which I actually binged it. And it's very good. It's very good. So I do recommend that. But there's something to possibly watch with that your wife might enjoy as well.
Okay. Yeah, great. No, I haven't actually heard of that one.
The framing device, as in the novel, it starts off with this Irish woman being abducted by the IRA itself, and her mystery kind of unravels multiple people's lives. But the main storyline is these two sisters, these teenage girls, who you see them, their parents were radicals, and they were like non-violent, but then eventually became part of the IRA. Then they were involved with the bombing in London. And of course, this spans from the 60s, where they are like dressing up as nuns and robbing banks to fund the IRA. So there's kind of like almost like a fun aspect to them when they're in their youth. But then as the weight of this gets more and more complex, as this thing drags on for decades, it's actually, and it covers their like lifespan. It's really well done. I really recommend it.
Fantastic. Is there anyone in it of note?
Rory Kinnear plays a British, like a real bastard, a true person who had been involved with using like counterterrorism in Africa in the African colonies, and he's brought in to subvert the IRA. And he's like a really dark character. He's like very pragmatic, but he explains that you just have to arrest these people. At one point, explains that you just roll somebody out with like a bag on their head and never tell them who this informant supposedly is, and then just let them turn on each other and kill each other off. And it's like such a really dark and grim kind of psyop operation in a way. And it did make me think about the parallels with what's happening, at different places around the world right now. So it's very current in its own way. It just really shows the futility of all of this on both sides. Like everybody's just so corrupt by the end of the whole situation. It's really interesting a watch for sure. But that's it. I think that's actually a plus. These girls, I do not know these young actresses, and they're fantastic. So in my mind, they simply are these sisters. So that's actually a positive for this type of story, I think.
That sounds great. I'll check it out.
Yeah, definitely recommend it. And it's available as a binge, so very easy to watch. I watched half of it I think it premiered on Thursday. And by Thursday or Friday, I had watched half of it. Then my wife started watching on her own. And now she's binging her way through it. And while she's binging through the first half, I binged through the second half. So we watched the whole thing pretty much.
Separately, though.
Yeah, exactly. Well, but we still get to talk about it. When she's on episode 3, I'm like, oh, yeah, let me talk about that with you. And we rarely watch things together, actually. So it's kind of a pleasure in that way.
Okay, that's good. Yeah. It's difficult to sync up sometimes your watching habits.
Absolutely. Yeah, and as far as this episode goes, we finally get to kind of have a traditional one episode breakdown. So I was taking notes right before you joined to kind of walk through the plot a little bit. And then I have many questions. From your initial reaction when you contacted me, I think you have a more positive reaction to this than I did. I actually thought this was a good episode. I'm more worried about the direction the show is going in, I'll say. But we'll save that for the end.
Okay.
And before we get into it, did you want to recommend anything you've seen this week?
I watched A Quiet Place Day 1 yesterday. I'd seen the previous 2 Quiet Place movies, and I thought they were really good, very good. And this one was a bit different. New actors, new setting. It is a day 1, so it's when the aliens attack. It's working it all out. Lupita Nyong'o, I think. Yeah, she's fantastic in it. And I thought it had quite a nice sentiment towards the end. Once you realised what was going on and how she was wanting to go back to relive her youth, I thought it was really nice at the end. I thought it was a bit different to normal types of those types of movies. Yeah,
I liked it. I thought she was fantastic. I'm in general a big fan of hers, but I would my 2 critiques of it. One is I have never seen a cat that's that casual. That was like, it really freaked me, like took me out of it. Like cats are not that chill, especially in the water, by the way.
Yeah,
and the second thing that bothered me was, like, this is me just nitpicking, but it really drives me nuts. I live right outside New York City. And in New York City, like if someone's doing construction, if you're on the avenue, it's like an echo chamber. If someone drops a pipe at the top of the avenue, a quarter of a mile, half a mile away, making noise all the way down there. So the fact that these things could triangulate sound, all she had to do was like make one car start beeping its horn, and that is echoing all over the city. Like you would draw every single creature from. It would be the easiest way to camouflage your movements would be in New York City, is my personal opinion.
And on that cat, the cat's name was Frodo. I watched it with my kids, and one of them was like, "This cat better live throughout this film. I'm not watching it if this cat is going to die."
That's the funniest thing about it, is I know people who really like the movie and love the cat. And I love the cat, like as an actor. I thought he did a good job, but I'm just like, no cat would ever be this chill. This is insane. The cat is way more composed than the people are, basically, at every turn.
True. Very true.
In general, I do recommend it, although it's probably my least favorite of the 3, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
Okay, let's get into the episode. So I don't think these episodes have titles. If they do, I didn't notice them anywhere. I looked them up on IMDb. I looked them on the Peacock app, and it's like episode 6. I'm like, I guess this is episode 6. So we start off right where we left off at the end of episode 5. We have the Jackal, whose name we still don't know, I think. We definitely don't know his real name. We don't even know what his wife calls him, or did I miss that? We have not heard her address him with a name, have we?
I feel like we did. I feel like she has a name for him. I can't remember it.
It should be Jack.
Wrong, but yeah.
Jack, middle initial L. So yeah, he's in this farm. He's in this barn, I should say. He got knocked out by this. I had actually speculated on the episode we did before, this might be someone who was tailing him or something, but no, he's just this like surly farmer who doesn't like people sleeping in his barn, apparently.
Yeah, and that's how it came off. I thought it was a farmer as well. I thought it was just
Yeah,
a random guy, and that was told to us straight away at the beginning of
right.
this episode, wasn't it?
Yeah, but it seems extreme. Right? He like tied this guy up all night. Like, what is going on? Like, but anyway, this guy's a very wary farmer, to say the least. Basically, just after torturing him all night by hanging him by his arms, he just decides to let him go in the morning, but finds the plastic gun, which, of course, you find a plastic rifle, you immediately are suspicious. And the Jackal, of course, Jack L. Smith, whatever his name is, he wanted to pay his way out of this, basically, but they have this language barrier. And this is when he gets his friend on the phone. Is Laszlo, this young guy. By the way, the farmer's name is Gabby, an interesting name, I guess maybe a common name out there. Laszlo's on the phone. He does speak English. He's able to translate. And then this other friend and Laszlo are basically on the way to the farm. This farmer decides the very bad decision here to torture him by making him eat like some fermented pork fat or something. I don't know what he was trying to force feed him. But of course, that gets him a knife in the chest. And, Jackal makes his escape, but he can't start the car. And of course, the car starts just as these guys show up, gets behind the car, shoots this guy's ankles out from underneath him. Very painful to watch, but he does not kill Laszlo. And at first I was thinking, well, of course he needs Laszlo to help him escape, but there's more to this actually. So what did you think about this whole opening action sequence here?
Yeah, I loved it. I don't know why he wouldn't have take a bite. Surely he's hungry.
Yeah, right.
I don't know. I mean, it's a local delicacy. He was trying to be friendly to him. He was going to let him go anyway. But yeah, it was thrilling. I really wanted the Jackal to get away. I knew he was in big trouble,
Yep.
being hung up all night. You could see that he was going to find his way to get over this farmer and get out. But then the car wouldn't start, and then he got hopped in the other car. And these guys, one had a rifle and one had a rubber bullet gun.
Yeah.
He wasn't in trouble from that guy, but it was a great action sequence to start the show for sure.
I'm going to have other critiques of this episode, but I mean, in general, in the show, I think whenever the action is going and the suspense is really excellent. And speaking of the suspense, of course, we know that Bianca was hot on his tail. The last episode. Again, she shows up here shortly thereafter. As soon as they get a report that something happened in a nearby farm, she's right there. So they are right behind him at this point. So there's a very tense situation. And of course, there's an ironic moment where they're literally next to each other, but we'll get to that later on.
Yeah, it was 10 kilometers away from the original crime scene. So he
Right.
did make some distance and then got caught.
That's a good point. Good point. Yeah. That's quite a distance, but I assume anything suspicious within even a 20-mile radius, probably you're going to immediately respond to that.
And he was in big trouble, and you could feel that he was in big trouble. He'd lost some of his kit, and how was he going to get out of this country? And these rogue farmers that are weaponized, and they want to take him down.
Exactly. They don't even know who they got at this point, actually. They probably would know, though, because on the way in, we hear on the radio, right, that they're basically in hot pursuit. So they know, like, they're probably showing up Laszlo, or not, probably not Laszlo, but the other guy who seems much more pragmatic, who doesn't say anything to this, the roadblock, obviously, because he's probably thinking like, oh, we can probably get a lot of money from this guy. So it is questionable how moral these people were. I don't know if they needed to die or not. By the way, like, this farmer seems super shady. Like, I don't think that this guy's all on the up and up anyway. He's not only willing to take the bribe, but just that you find somebody on your property and you're willing to like string them up. He is a super suspicious person. Like, maybe he's criminally involved in some way. Regardless, Laszlo does seem like an innocent in this whole thing, just dragged into it.
And the way Laszlo gets treated by his co-worker is not very nice either.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe that's kind of why the Jackal has some sympathy towards him there. And then a couple of things happen here in this car ride. Laszlo does get him through the barrier. He could potentially try to make a break for it or give some kind of warning to the police barricade, but he does help him out. They get through that. In the meantime, this is where I worry a little bit about the direction of the character of the Jackal. We see him using these different phones to eventually call Nuria, his wife, who apparently is with her mom at the bank trying to figure out, like, well, how much of this money is mine if I got divorced? This is not a 50-50 state. Like in California, everything's 50-50. These, wherever they are in Spain, I guess it is, 15%. It's a little rough, but I mean, if he's really rich, I guess 15% is not so bad. So
that's right. Yeah. Yeah, she's got her own little missions going on, pushed by her mom and her brother as well.
Her mom's planning ahead, so she might need to. So he reaches out to Nuria. She seems to be like, Mom, I'm off this side mission we have right here. I'm going to go and help him out. So he needs her. He's in a really bad spot. He's desperate. He turns to her, which I'm pretty sure this is the first time he's ever turned to her. This is what's kind of weird about this situation. Just your gut feeling, how do you think they're going to be using Nuria going forward? Do you think she will accept it? I mean, she's already suspicious that he might be a killer, right? All those guns are make her concerned. How do you think that they might be using her, and how she might respond once you know everything that's going on?
That's a good question. I really like the way that he got her involved. He knew that she was his only chance, and the kind of acting that he put on as the character to try to pull her in. I mean, it was horrible, very deceptive.
Yep.
And I was wondering when he would use that knowledge that she knows about the secret room,
right?
When he would actually use it to bring her in, and she came in full board, didn't she? I mean, she was conflicted about her feelings towards him, but she definitely wanted to help him, and she did everything she could and everything that he asked for, even though she was extremely angry at him.
Exactly.
And so she hops straight back on a plane back to Spain, I assume. And that's a good question. I'm not sure how they're going to use her later in the series.
It makes me think about it just in hearing your answer too. I think about how she probably is very conflicted and what might be driving her back and forth. You have to assume the fact that she has this child with him has changed her calculus significantly, right? You can imagine like, well, if I can get out of this and get some money, but now all of a sudden being like, well, they got this kid, and I think she's got to start feeling really suspicious that there's something really bad going on here, right?
And isn't that exciting for her as well? I mean, she's stuck up in that giant mansion up in the hills. She's finally trying to understand who her husband is, and she's trying to get to the core of him. And so that must be really exciting for her to find these more layers, whereas he's very just surface level so far. But now he's actually becoming a real person that she's actually finding out about him. Possibly, she thinks.
That is an interesting direction I hadn't considered. That makes me, now that you just said that, makes me a little more interested in this, because until now, she seems like she's so shoehorned into the story. Why did they even add this family? But now that you say that, I do start thinking of other films, like True Lies is an example of this, or Mr. and Mrs. Smith, where you have a relationship that's maybe not working out because these people are lying to each other. But now potentially, like you said, there's some darkness and some mystery that is part of the attraction. And now that if you're inside of that, does it actually become something that drives you together in a way? That would be an interesting twist on this. I, once again, am probably overly biased in my opinion of the original material. So I'm thinking about this very much about being a lone wolf story. But it is interesting to consider, what if she becomes a bigger part of this and she helps him cover it up? And who knows? I don't know if this was supposed to be a one-off or possibly multiple seasons, but you could imagine the story expanding. And if she can somehow alibi him or help him get some kind of escape, that maybe this is something that does continue.
And possibly if she becomes a target later in the series, or she's in danger, that might trigger him to actually care for her.
Right.
Rather than just use her as his cover.
That still is the problem I have with Redmayne's performance. I'm still not convinced. Like oftentimes, like that scene last week where he's like, I really love you and I want to confide in you. And he seems conflicted in how much he wants to tell her. There's that last shot that's like lingering where we just see his eyes over her shoulder. It's supposed to play, I think, as in like he's sincere, but is he just like a reptilian killer? But for me, I'm just like seeing that last part and being like, I'm always thinking he's ready to I always assume he's about to kill her. He's just waiting for his opportunity. But I could be totally wrong about that. It may just be the Redmayne performance doesn't work for me in these parts as well as it does when he's the calculating killer.
Yeah, well, he had an opportunity to kill that Laszlo guy that helped him, and he was looking at his phone and of the picture of Laszlo with his wife and child. And what was he thinking? Was he thinking, oh, I mean, why did he let him go? He didn't have to let him go, or maybe he did, to kind of get into that mindset to use his own wife. I don't know.
Yeah, that's part of my concern with the direction the show is going in, because he brings in his wife, obviously. And there could be, just like you mentioned, there could be some benefits to this that I'm not foreseeing, because she rescues him here. And then he can think, even from just a purely practical point of view, he may need that kind of assistance in the future as well. So maybe it is good to not always be a lone wolf, especially when he has this big of a target. But the Laszlo thing, I think, is also a little concerning, because he's like, just promise me that you won't say anything, or, I know where you live. So this guy could just make an anonymous tip, like, and he's not so dumb that he doesn't realize that. Like, it just doesn't work for me. I mean, if I'm
Exactly.
Laszlo, I am going to go home and figure out some way to anonymously drop a tip. And I'm like, is he going to show up at my house and he's going to know that I tipped him off? This guy could just end up dead for 100 different reasons tomorrow. And I don't think he's going to come after me. That's not going to be his priority when he's, like in another country trying to murder somebody. Literally, if I'm that circumstance, I'll say anything I need to get out of that situation. The moment I'm safe, I'm like going to be, here's what he looked like. Here's how tall he was.
Yeah, for sure. It was a mistake to let him go. It was a mistake for sure.
Totally. And, once again, it speaks to the fact that he is slipping, right? Like we saw him last week when he's like looking at those birds. I didn't even bring this up in our recap previous because there were so many episodes to cover, but he's like looking at those birds. You brought it up that he had messed up. I think that's directly what you were referencing. Has that fender bender with that truck, and the truck driver won't take a payoff. So he just kills him and the cop right in the middle of the street. That was clever, him switching their firearms. So it looks like they shot each other. But I don't think he wanted to kill that truck driver. He wanted to get out of the circumstance as cleanly as possible. But B, it's like he's losing it a little bit here, don't you think?
Yeah, that was an amazing scene, by the way. We didn't talk about that. That's epic. That was one of the best of the series. So the birds came into it this episode as well. So the birds come, it's a flashback to his time, I assume, in Afghanistan.
Right.
Where there was some tragedy that happened, or all his unit died, or something went on that he's really conflicted about, and that flock of birds has played into that, and I think that's maybe why he's getting these memories coming back.
That's a good point. Yeah, it might be that that was a trigger in some way when he was looking at them, or maybe he got distracted. When I'm sure we'll see more of that backstory, and we assume this is the person that all the way back in episode 2 or somewhere up there during that 5-episode binge. I can't remember; it's all a blur. But somewhere in there was this revelation that one of the few people who could make this shot, he was in the UK military. He was like a sharpshooter. He could have made that shot, but he died. He died in this bombing. But of course, he never got the body because it was a bombing. So it's somehow he escaped. We was presuming that this is indeed the person that he is. And now his flashback seems to indicate that definitely he is, if not that person, he was in that group. And yeah, the birds may be some kind of trigger that he's seen, memory to that. But that also, my personal taste, I don't know if I need to know all these biographical details about the Jackal.
No, and it's his last job as well. He thinks it's his last job before retirement. So all these things come up.
Right. Well, that's the other thing, was when he's talking to Nuria, she says, why do you need this complex of a costume? Do you really think you need it? And he's like, yes, I do think I do. And she, of course, helped him with this ruse by being there with him. And it's this old man's costume. Basically, it's this costume, very convincing old man makeup, very well done. And he's wearing a soft cast, which, of course, is the disassembled plastic gun. She says to him, is this all worth it? And he says, it was, which I thought was an interesting point. It was. So does that mean it's not worth it anymore? Does he have second thoughts? I don't think he can back out at this point. I mean, these people know where he is. They know who he is. They know what he looks like. They've been in his hotel room, right? So he's probably not safe.
Yeah, they can find him for sure. And they have, when he was the old man being wheeled through the airport, that was great scene as well. When you see the police that are on his tail, but they just don't notice him. It's a perfect costume. An old person, you don't look. I mean, it's terrible to say, but you just don't look at older people. And it was good. I mean, she didn't look at him at all. She didn't look at him and give a bit of a look. Oh, could that be? He was just completely invisible to them. And then they get on the same plane. I thought that they could have been more done with that on that plane. I wanted to see her sitting in front of him and maybe reclining the seat or something. I don't know.
Yeah, that could have been fun. That's true. I thought they were going to be like more like if he was going to be messing with them, like dropping drinks on them or something just to troll them. But I'm like, that would be pushing his luck for sure at this point. But yeah, it would have been fun if she was like, backing it to him or something, and he's just awkwardly dealing with this whole thing. And of course, she knows what he looks. He knows what she looks like, I should say. She does not know what he looks like. Definitely not in the makeup. But I did like also that she turns up at the farm right after he's escaped, and he's basically at the roadblock, so that they're so close together, not even realizing it. And then they call her back to London, and she's so annoyed by this, like going like, well, we're right on his tail. They're like, no, come back to London. And then they redirect her to Estonia, so they end up on the same plane. So she's like annoyed by being diverted. I'm like, you're sitting right next to the guy. You just don't realize it right now. Just turn around. He's right there. So that all of that is a lot of fun in these type of films in general.
And so we're in Estonia now, and this is where UDG is going to give his talk, and we're here at the scene, maybe a bit early, I don't know, in the series. I mean, feels like this is going to be the big climax. I don't know.
Well, it's in 4 days, right? Because he has that whole conversation. I was wondering if, and maybe it still is, that if there's something else going on where he's rolling out this river technology, but it's really not that big a deal. But people are saying, like, they're going to try to kill you. Like, so he knows that this hit is out on him. And he's like, nope, we're going to launch it in 4 days, very publicly. So they're warning him that he might have a target on his back. But so now the clock is ticking, right? Because we know this is 4 days out. And of course, he was scoping out that arena where he's going to do the presentation. And we did see also like a little bit of, this is all going to pay off later on. They're showing how there's these plating, the bulletproof plating around him that, can see through. But of course, it's assuming the shot is coming from the audience side. It's not above him, right?
Yes,
So that could be
there's an
potentially
angle there for sure. Yeah,
right, exactly. And of course, he's interesting that that's the way he planned out the assassination, because he's assuming that the front, like shot from the front, is not going to work out. So he's like immediately trying to find the angle that wouldn't be covered. So we see that all being set up here, the groundwork for all of that here as well. I still don't understand, and hopefully this is something that's explained a little bit more, and it's not just an oversight, that this is technology. Like, right, if this guy gets killed, it's not like River doesn't go live, like unless he has some kind of special key that only he can unlock, which, I mean, I don't think that's going to be the case. It's not like if someone killed CEO of Amazon, it's not that Amazon Web Services go down the next day or something, right? So I'm not sure how this all would play out, other than just as a show of strength to be like, don't mess with us, or this will happen to you too. But I'm not sure if the technology could be turned off at this, but maybe there's more to it than they're playing right now.
Yeah, it's obviously very dangerous to pay someone, what is it, $100 million?
$100 million
to kill him. Yeah.
Yeah, but also going back to that idea of like, is this worth it or not? $100 million is, I mean, I don't need 100. I mean, maybe he needs $100 million. I don't need $100 million. I mean, it sounds like he's getting paid pretty well for some of these jobs. Like, I could, after the second or third hit, I might retire. That's what I would do. I don't know if I need the giant villa and the mansion. I could, as long as I could pay off my bills, and I might be satisfied.
I would have thought so. Yes.
And then, so he's back in Estonia. And interesting here. This I thought was clever, and wasn't expected. We see him taking off all the makeup. He's at the new hotel, and then there's a knock at the door. And I'm like, who are these? Are these those? Is this the people who hired him? Who, by the way, are starting to get very worried that he's not going to be able to do this. So he is definitely having that pressure. They think he's losing it, and they know this. He's making headlines at this point, so they're not too happy about the situation. But then he's at the hotel. He says, "I'm ready to go forward." They're even thinking about pulling the plug. He's like, "Nope, I'm ready to go." But then the cops show up, and they're like, there was a burglary in another Airbnb. And he immediately is like, I got to get out of this building. I don't want anyone investigating here. This is too close for comfort. So he needs a place to stay. So he calls up Rasmus. And I pointed this out in my recap earlier, that he seemed a little flirtatious with Rasmus. And by the way, I'm also bringing the original film into this, because a similar thing happens there as well. He hooks up with Rasmus. So what did you think about that sequence? Do you see that purely as him? Obviously, this guy's a security guard at the arena where he needs to do this assassination. So of course that could give him access, theoretically he can get like a card that gets him access, or maybe he's just like shows up with the guy and automatically bypasses security.
First of all, I liked that the Estonian police were actually smart.
Yeah.
They didn't just go, oh yeah, fine. You're nobody. They called the phone rang. So
right. Yes.
He's got to have, he's got to have all the plans working together. And even though he was extremely unhappy about it,
he had like, if looks could kill at that moment. It was great though.
You did perhaps spoil it a little bit in the last episode. That's
all
the original
inadvertent spoiling.
But it was telegraphed. You did see a little bit of flirtation earlier on in the series, and it obviously comes into play. And he needed this as a safe house. What better way? I mean, it's just good to have a man on the inside that you're close to. Whether he's gonna need him at some point,
right?
For sure. But again, just the ease with the Jackal just gets into this persona, whatever persona he needs.
Right.
He can just slide in. He ordered the guy an old fashioned, but the guy was just a normal. He just wanted a beer. So he had to change tack slightly just to be able to close the deal to get the spot on the couch.
Yeah, exactly. And he went through with it, of course. I mean, I guess you have to at that point. But I mean, that was his plan from the beginning. Yeah, and I did I mean, I kind of presumed I would be right about what I mentioned in the last episode, but at the same time, something's up because right away, the guy helps him find his phone and he walks out the door, but then he saves his phone number. So you're like, okay, he's going to call this guy up. And then, like you mentioned, I mean, there definitely was some kind of flirtation going on between the two of them. And then, of course, adding to that, like maybe it's not something you would pick up on as a casual watcher, but like you said, like if you've seen the original, and by the way, and the remake, the Bruce Willis remake, he does the same thing. So it's like, well, they probably included that here in the storyline once again. And of course, it did turn out to be the case. Yeah, and of course, that just like for all the reasons I mentioned before, it could give him, access. Even if the guy's just going to help him out, or the guy's going to vouch for him. But I think it's going to be more than that. He's probably going to be able to get him into the arena. Like, oh my God, I'm such a big fan of UDC. Can you get me in? And and then before you know it, right, he's there.
Well, what is he? He's an architectural engineer, so
Right.
he's
I
very
want to check it out.
yeah, he's very interested in this acoustic roof that he wants to copy.
Great that he actually brought that up right away, because you can imagine him going to check it out, the day before. Oh, you mentioned the acoustic roof. You want to go check it out? And like, oh, sure, why not? And meanwhile, he's like planting like his sniper rifle up there. I'm sure we'll see that. I don't know if we'll see the assassin. You think you'll see the assassination attempt in the very next episode? I mean, they can't drag this out for too long.
I don't think they can. You're right. Will the assassination attempt be successful? I don't know.
Like maybe we should just speculate here on it, because I'm curious about that as well. Option one, like you said, is it's a failure, right? Like he takes the shot and maybe there's a plate that he didn't see, like, maybe it is covered from the top or something, or someone spots him, or something happens, something goes wrong. I actually have a feeling something's going to go wrong. And then he's going to be in a panic for some kind of backup plan. He's like, I can still do this. That's my guess of what's going to happen. The other possibility is he pulls it off, and then there's some massive fallout. Maybe they turn on him, and then he has to go and it's like the killer, right? Where he goes and like now he's going to go on a vendetta. They can find him. He's like, well, I can find you too, and I'll come kill all of you guys, right? So that's the other way that the show could wrap up. So I'm leaning towards the assassination fails, and then he needs the backup plan. Although there could still be like a revenge setup. Maybe that's season 2. Maybe like season 2, they're coming to him and he's like, "You're coming after me. I'm coming after you." So, and then his family's on the line and everything. So it's possible.
And also, the river system will expose all the payments that he's received from all the jobs that he's done all over the years.
That's actually a really good point, right? His information will be in there as well. You'll see a $100 million payment from this particular company, with the word Jackal associated to it. Which of course everybody knows now. Somehow, this is another thing that maybe will get explained at some point, but I'm a little curious about. They're just like, we heard something in the chatter, something about Jackal, right? And I'm like, sometimes they just get these clues at convenient times. I could ding it for that, but I actually have a feeling maybe it's not so dumb. Maybe we'll find out that there is somebody higher up that is leaking this information intentionally, right? For some reason. So there could be something more involved. As a matter of fact, I thought this might be part of the River Project. Like leaking the information might be a way to expose the power of River itself. But UDC or whatever his name is seems surprised to hear this news. So I don't think he's the one who's leaking it, or people would know about it internally. Yeah. So I think there's more to come. Oh, here's a question I have for you. Do you have any guess as to who the mole is right now in the MI6?
I don't think it's the young bloke that sits next to her on
He
the
was
desk.
like, he's so obvious. I'm like, it can't be him.
So it's really one of the two senior people, possibly the most senior.
Yes, I have what's her name, Elizabeth? I had a feeling it's her because, of course, this week, OC, who's this actor's name?
Oh, he's very cool. Yeah, it could be him. It definitely could be him.
He was deleting messages this week that mentioned UDC, actually. So, and the investigation's going on. So it seemed like he's covering his tracks. But I have a feeling, once again, usually with these things, if you see somebody as the prime suspect, that's usually subterfuge. So I think that it's probably the intention for us to think he might be leaking information around her or something, for example, to undermine her in some ways. And maybe he suspects it's her. But yeah, he was definitely my suspect number one, because the guy who sits next to her is way too obvious. They've like literally mentioned him multiple times on the episode. And then he's telling her, make sure your circle's really tight, but talk to me. So I'm like, oh, he's the guy. But now as soon as we see him like deleting those messages, I'm like, nah, it's too obvious. Now it's not him. It's got to be like Elizabeth herself, right? So I agree. That's probably going to be the revelation.
And the guy on the desk, he's still got a job, doesn't he? He's trying to find out the deceased soldier that
Oh,
could be
right.
the Jackal. He might come into it later on. He might get a crucial bit of information that proves that this guy is not actually dead.
This guy is like suspect number one usually, or appears to be, but he's also kind of an idiot because like when multiple times like, but he's dead, but he's dead. Have you seen a spy movie before? These guys need to watch more spy TV shows because this is like this guy's like, this is 101. Unless if there's no body, he's not dead.
For sure. Yeah, looking forward to it. Yeah. Next season, next episode.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm also looking forward to it. It is fun that they dropped those five all at once. Not great for the conversation. Like I preferred having more room here to have this conversation with you. We talked for about the same amount of time about one episode versus half a season. So I did prefer having the space to have the conversation. How is it doing in Australia? By the way, I read an article saying that in the UK it was like the biggest premiere of a series on Sky, I think, maybe ever. It was like significantly larger than the comps they had, and all those other shows were very popular. So, is this popular in Australia as well? Do you think, or as much so?
It's big. Yeah, I read a similar article saying that it was. I mean, it's on a streaming service called Binge here, which has a lot of the Max shows, and they said it's the biggest show of the year on
Yep.
this streamer. When I launch it up, it's the landing page, so it's right there. It wants you to keep watching. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the audience reaction has been mostly positive too. Oh, I do want to mention one thing, one last note that I actually just wrote down. So I went online. I try to avoid audience reaction in general, but sometimes I get curious. So I went online and I had my qualms about this episode being like, are they making him too, PTSD? Like, are they playing into that a little too much? And I do wonder because if he's such a successful and almost invisible assassin, I just don't buy that this is the first time that this happened to him. And maybe it isn't. Maybe he's just been a lone wolf, so he never had to deal with it in some ways. So he's exposing himself in some ways. So maybe this is part of his evolution as a character. But I do find like really now all of a sudden this PTSD is catching up to him, whatever. So that's what I was looking for people to say like, why are they making him, have this, softer side all of a sudden? And I was waiting to see that reaction. But of course, with social media being what it is, that was not the reaction. They're like, this is woke 2024. Now he's got to be gay. They're all freaking out about that thing. And I'm just like, first of all, I'm like, they obviously don't listen to my podcast, but I'm like I said, this is woke 2024. This novel was written in 1960 something, and it was in the original novel, 60 years old almost. First of all, it's not new to this story. Second of all, it's been in every version of it, including the Bruce Willis version from the 90s. So this has always been part of the story. But not only that is the fact that, like, yeah, he is, from a perspective of being a spy, he simply wants to leverage somebody, and he could care less. He murders people. Like, and this is the thing that upset people. It's just so crazy. I'm like, okay, well, yeah, go ahead.
He just does what's needed to complete the job to get to the next level.
Exactly.
I mean, whether
Like, as
it's
if
to kill someone, whether it's to seduce someone,
right,
it just seemed like a logical thing. Use this person that comes into your life,
right.
and yeah,
As if that's like he's gone a bridge too far or something. It's like he murders people. What are you talking about? He's not going to take an opportunity when he can find it. What are you talking about? This guy's willing to murder people. Like, there's been a lot of collateral damage to, the people when he broke into that building at the beginning of the season. He killed everybody that he saw there, right? These are security guards, cleaning people, like whoever happened to be in his way. And he was merciless. He didn't. So the idea that he's like totally amoral, but then he would not seduce someone that when he had the opportunity to, I'm like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, I definitely don't have high hopes for this security guard in the future.
Yeah, that's the other thing about it too, is I think people are probably reading that like he fell in love with this guy or something. I'm like, no, I think that he'll dispose of him as soon as he doesn't need him anymore. So
yeah,
that all remains to be seen. But I'm pretty sure this is just another stepping stone, like you mentioned, just another way to get to his goal. Yeah, very excited for next week. And then the week after that, we start seeing the agency as well. So maybe we can touch base on that as well as we go forward.
Yeah, I saw the trailer for that. That looks very exciting. Michael Fassbender in fine form for sure.
Yeah, he looks great. He's got that cold, dead-eyed stare in that preview that they get at his best. Yeah. So very much looking forward to that. Fassbender's really. I was just thinking about that when we talked last time. There are those moments, even in the trailer, you see him where he like softens, where he's with his love interest or whatever. And I really like to see him as an actor. I think that's what makes. I think I've said this on the podcast before, but I think what makes someone a TV star versus a movie star is when you can just see someone's face fill the screen like as tall as a building, and you can just see them reacting. Have you seen Conclave by chance?
Not yet. No.
Conclave is like Ray Fiennes' face just fills the screen, and there are times when he's hearing someone talk and there's no dialogue. He hears someone talk, and all of a sudden he's figured something out, and you see it on his face. It's incredible. And there's times when like someone's talking about like he was friends with the Pope, and they're telling this, he's hearing someone say something bad about him, and like a tear runs down his face as he's saying something else, and you know he's like remembering his time with him or whatever, right? And you're like, wow, that's just like that's acting, like, you know, movie acting. You can see it, the whole story's playing out on his face. And I think that's something that like TV actors don't have to be able to do. You need to have an interesting face, and you need to be able to convey it all on the screen without, you know, saying too much. And that's what I really, Fassbender has something really interesting where he can have a very like warm expression, and then he can go into like a dead eye, like, you know, that you crossed the line or something, and he goes cold as ice, like, and it just happens on his face. And I'm like, I don't know how you do that, but he goes from being like empathetic to like, I will kill you. And you just see it pass across his face, and it's like a really like a skill. And by the way, a great skill to have for a spy show. So I can't wait for that.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, he was very good in those couple of Alien movies that he was in, where he played the android.
I do not
Very
like those
cold.
Alien movies, but he's fantastic in them for sure. He's really the reason to watch those for sure. Yeah, thank you very much. That was a lot of fun to talk about, to relive the episode.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks again.
Thanks for the conversation. All right, have a great week.
Great. Thanks, Victor. Bye.
Okay, so that was the conversation. Make sure you subscribe so you know when our new episodes become available. We will continue to be watching The Day of the Jackal. Sona and I will be watching Based on a True Story this week. Lots of Oscar movie roundup reviews. And of course, maybe most of all, The Agency. We will be watching The Agency, another spy thriller, starting just next week. Stay tuned for all that. I'll talk to you soon.